Godsil, and I'm the co-founder and director of research for the Perception Institute. I'm delighted to be here with you today to present Mind Science's tools and tactics for the National Park Service. The National Park Service is obviously embarking upon an exciting endeavor to increase the diversity and the degree to which the Park Service is welcome to every member of our community, both nationally and internationally. And because those goals are positive and aspirational, one of the challenges becomes, why is this difficult? Well, first of all, as we may know, we're in an age in which there's quite a bit of explicit bias that people are experiencing. When we talk about explicit bias, what we talk about are attitudes and beliefs that people have about other groups on a conscious level. So right now in the country, we're seeing quite a bit of explicit bias about certain members of our communities, women who are wearing hijabs, for example. There continues to be some explicit bias linked to gender. Today, we're not talking about explicit bias because the presumption is, based upon the amazing work of the National Park Service, that everyone in the Park Service shares the goal of creating a sense of belonging within the Park Service, that everyone is included. So what we're here to talk about are a set of mind science tools, beginning with something we call implicit bias. But before we move to what implicit bias means or what any of these tools are, I'm going to ask you to take a moment and step back and experience how your brain works. We're going to start with a test that was created by Dr. Stroop in 1935. And whether you're with a group or whether you're by yourself, my ask of you is that you actually state out loud the color of the text that you see. So do a practice run. Hopefully you saw and stated out loud the color blue, even if you're by yourself and it feels silly. This is a really useful test to understand how our brains operate. So let's begin. So if you're like most people, you were doing really well for the first 5 or so clumps of text. You said blue, red, green, black, green, very quickly and confidently. But then when you got to the next clump of text where there were black letters, you probably said red. And then you probably said blue, even though the letters are red for the next clump of text. And think about for a second why that might have been. These are simple colors. They're not the J. Crew, sort of sea foam or mauve. They're primary colors that you know very well. But probably what your brain did is what most of our brains did, which is you read the words instead of stating the color of the text. We've been trained to do that since we were children, and our brains do what comes naturally, what comes normally, what seems like the habit that we formed over time. So what we usually do now at Perception, because again, the role of our work is to bring the mind sciences into play in important domains like the National Park Service, is we actually ask you to think about how it is the ways that our brains work can affect the work that we do every day. So here's another test. How many triangles do you see? Just look at the page for a second and count. We've received answers from 4 to 6 to 8 to 13. But if you take a second and think about what a triangle is, you'll actually realize the number 0. Because a triangle, of course, are 3 lines all connected together. And there are none on here. But we see triangles because the question is, how many triangles do you see? And our brains fill in the empty spaces. This is part of the amazing work that our unconscious brain does. What our unconscious brain does is it takes all the stimuli around us, and it makes meaning from it. The scientific word for this is schema. And so schema is a shortcut, a mental structure that we have in our brain that organizes the information around us and allows us to make judgments efficiently and quickly. It allows us to see words and quickly read them. It allows us to sort of see partial shapes or partial bits of information and make sense of it. And what we've learned is our unconscious brain is so much more powerful than our conscious brain. The current estimate is that our unconscious brain processes 11 million bits of information in the same amount of time that our conscious brain processes 40. That's a remarkable gap between what our unconscious brain and our conscious brain does, but if you think about all that we need to accomplish, it makes sense. I did a training recently in the Grand Canyon and thought about all of the incredible detail and the stone all around the Grand Canyon, and how most of us walk through the Grand Canyon and just see broad general colors, but those who are, who are geologists and who are experts in the Grand Canyon see so much detail in every bit of rock because it's relevant to them. To most of us, we just see beauty. So this is the work of our unconscious brain, and it's spectacular and wonderful and utterly critical for us to be human. The challenge is that these schemas that we create, which are basically categories, also apply to humans. We put humans into groups as well, and that also serves a functional purpose. You need to know who the park ranger is so you know who to follow, whose directions to follow when you're in the Park Service. As a person in regular life, you need to know who the doctor is so you know who can give you a shot without it being actually some sort of violent assault. But when it comes to schemas, they can be dangerous in other contexts, and often the conscious image of who fits a certain category may be different than the quick processing that our brain does. So when you see the word parents, you probably have a quick image of who constitute parents, and that image may not constitute a same-sex family, although consciously you may be very supportive of the fact that families come in many different shapes and sizes. When you see the word engineer, I know for me, I frankly don't picture a woman. I picture a man. I grew up in the 70s, and this was a common understanding of who an engineer was. When you see the word doctor, I know for me, the image of this African-American woman is very familiar, but I know for most people, it may not be, and in fact, you may have heard about the incident on Delta Airlines where there was a passenger in distress, and as often happens, the flight attendants asked for whether or not there's a doctor on board, and an African-American woman raised her hand and said she was a doctor, and the flight attendant didn't believe her. She showed her credentials, and she still was suspect. A white male said he was a doctor, and the flight attendant sent him right along the way to help the passenger. It turned out they needed the help of this one female doctor, and she, of course, did so, but the schema of the flight attendant didn't include an African-American woman as a doctor, and this could have resulted in a passenger's demise. The reason that at Perception we use the word doctor here is because when we Googled doctor, and many of us use Google as a way to find images, it took many, many pages before we saw a black woman, and this was several months before the incident on Delta. So what you can realize from this is we can have a schema for who fits into a particular category that isn't consistent with our conscious image of who an engineer could be, or who parents are, or certainly who a doctor can be, but that our unconscious brain may not be consistent with our conscious brain. Schemas consist of, with respect to people, two categories within the category schema. One is the associations we make with a particular group, so the stereotypes we have about a particular group. Also, the attitudes we have about a particular group, the feelings. And sometimes we have positive stereotypes about a group and negative attitudes, or vice versa. For example, historically, with respect to people who are identified as Jewish, there were many stereotypes that in a sense were positive, hardworking, sort of careful, but there were many negative attitudes that we saw historically. Today, with respect to the elderly, most people have very positive attitudes. We think of our grandparents, we think of Sunday dinner, so we have warm feelings, but there are a host of negative stereotypes about competence with respect to the elderly that are very powerful, and that can undermine people's treatment of the elderly when it comes to challenging tasks or in a job context. Some stereotypes exist historically and persist, and we'll talk about those, and some stereotypes that were very powerful in earlier eras no longer apply. If you saw me before you, I would probably tell you, even if you couldn't guess, that I'm Irish Catholic. That's my heritage. And the image before you is an image of an Irish Catholic woman in 1866 being compared to Florence Nightingale, who was someone who was Protestant and English. In the 1900s, Irish Catholics were literally seen as less than human. They were seen as savage, sort of degenerate, promiscuous, drunk, all these really horrific negative stereotypes. But as, again, many of you probably know, those stereotypes are sort of remnants of history now. Very few people know about them, except perhaps the stereotype about the Irish as being drunk. And frankly, even that stereotype is one usually said with a wink and a smile, and only around St. Patrick's Day. So these are stereotypes that were very powerful at a certain period in our country's history, as well as European history, that no longer persist, and therefore those of us who are Irish Catholic no longer experience any particular negative outcomes as a result of them. But what we know is for some groups in our country, there continue to be a set of automatic stereotypes that are linked to them as a result of their membership in particular groups. Where do those come from? Even among those of us who reject the stereotypes, largely they come from the media. Right now as a country, we are actually hyper-segregated. We are more likely to live apart from each other based upon our membership in a particular racial or ethnicity than we were a few years after the court case Brown versus Board of Education. So we often learn information about each other not at backyard barbecues or when we bring our children to school, but actually through the news. And it turns out that news sources are often very distorted. This is a content analysis done by someone who works at the Perception Institute, looking at the stereotypes about Latinos on different news sources, and this was around 2012. And so you'll see three different news sources, Fox News, the traditional network news, and MSNBC. And what you can see when you look at those bars are that dramatic prevalence of negative stereotypes of Latinos being on welfare, taking quote-unquote our jobs, refusing to speak English, having too many kids. And those stereotypes are prevalent on all of these news sources, particularly the latter two are, again, consistent across news sources. So no matter what news we watch, we're actually being fed a set of negative stereotypes about those who are understood to be Latino that lead to stereotypes that follow people in their daily lives. So all of this combines to become something that occurs within our brain that we call implicit bias. This is our brain's automatic instant association of stereotypes, traits, or attitudes, feelings toward particular groups without our conscious awareness. Implicit biases are important because they're automatic. We can actually know that we have implicit biases. I know, as I described to you, that I have an implicit association of engineers with men. The fact that I know that I have that bias doesn't mean that it completely disappears. What it does mean is that I know that I have to take some steps to make sure that I don't translate this automatic association I have into the way that I treat people or the way that I evaluate people. So the big question is, knowing that our brains create these biases because of how we process information, what is it that we can do about them? Another implicit association about attitudes of who fit into particular groups. So you have three images in front of you. One is from the Depression era on the far left. It's of a white woman with her two children. So the famous image from the Depression era by Dorothea Lange. If we looked at the actual numbers, an updated version of this image would be part of who we think of as poor now. There are 19 million poor white people in this country. But because of a whole result of decisions and, again, stereotypes that were perpetuated, most people think of poor single mothers with their children as African American. In fact, there are fewer African-American poor people overall in this country than any other group. In some places, New York City, for example, Asian Americans are actually more likely to be poor, but in fact, most people don't think of poverty and Asian American in the same image in their mind because of, again, stereotypes, and so people can be overlooked. So in thinking about how our brains operate, how we see people, what assumptions we make, it's really important to understand that these implicit biases can result in mistakes and distortions. So how do we know we have bias? First of all, the science suggests every single one of us has some biases, again, because of the way our brains operate. But we can actually find out what particular biases we may have by taking what's called the implicit association test. This can be found by Googling Project Implicit or Implicit Association Test, and it's a computer exercise on the Harvard University website that allows you to see, based upon speed, what images are associated in your mind with particular groups. So if you think back to the Stroop test, the color test that we did earlier, this is a variation of that, but instead of using simple colors and words, it uses different groups and associations of either positive feelings, attitudes, or particular traits, stereotypes. And what it measures is whether we can as quickly associate particular groups with positive feelings, as in the case before you. So this is called the Race Implicit Attitude Test, and what it does is it allows you to see images of a face, either a black face or a white face, and then particular words, either words associated with pleasant images or words associated with negative images, and it allows you to just literally press a button when you see the particular face and the particular word, and by seeing whether you can be equally quick with the positive words and one face and the positive word in another face, and similarly the negative word with one face and the negative word with another face, you can see whether you're neutral about a particular group, you can be quick on both sides, or whether you are quicker to associate positive words with one group than the other, and that will suggest you have implicit bias toward the group who you can associate positive words with, as opposed to the group you associate negative words with. Most Americans, and particularly most white Americans, are much faster associating positive words with a white face than we are with a black face. That's not because we're classically racist. We may absolutely reject any negative stereotypes about African Americans or any other group, but because we have these negative stereotypes that are in the culture, we can still have these automatic associations that manifest themselves, that show themselves in this test. And so the test is really valuable because it helps us understand and know which groups we may have bias against. Some of you may be wondering, well, doesn't everybody just like their own group better? So doesn't it make sense that if you're white, you're faster to associate positive words with a white face? And wouldn't it also be the case if you're black that you'd be faster to associate positive words with a black face? It turns out that in every country in the world, the group that is seen as sort of dominant is much more likely to have implicit bias toward its own group, to be faster with positive words with its own group than groups that are non-dominant. So if we were in the Netherlands, people who are Dutch have a high level of implicit bias against people who are Arab, but people who are Arab don't have nearly the same level of bias against people who are perceived as Dutch. So this is not an individual characteristic, and it's not a universal characteristic. This is a cultural tendency based upon, again, the images we have in our particular country. So what does it mean to have implicit bias? Does it translate into the world in any particular way? It turns out, yes. Our implicit biases, if we don't know about them, if we don't act to check them, are actually more predictive of our behavior than our explicit beliefs, again, because of how quickly our brain works. So here's an example. You wouldn't think that gender would have anything to do with how we hear music, but it turns out there's a stereotype that has existed in the classical music world that male musicians are more talented somehow than female musicians. And so for a very long time, orchestras tended to be largely male. So some suggested we don't need to see who's auditioning, we just need to hear the music. So they put up screens, and there was a test done to see whether putting up the screens so people couldn't see the person who was auditioning would change the makeup of who was hired for orchestras on gender grounds. Initially, there wasn't much change, and so the people who were doing the auditions, of course, said we were right. We were just listening for the most talented musicians. But then someone noticed that before some of the auditions, there was a click, click, click sound. I hope you're thinking what that click, click, click sound might have been. It was high heels, and that auditory cue of the high heels was enough to trigger gender in people's minds. And again, this wasn't conscious. It's not that people didn't want to have women in the orchestras. It was that they were listening through the lens, the auditory lens of gender, and that resulted in people thinking less of the person who was auditioning. How do we know this? Because what they did to make up for this auditory cue is some orchestras put, sort of a rubber rug or a woolen rug down to muffle the noise. Other orchestras simply asked people to take off their shoes. And once those auditory clicks disappeared, the female new hires for orchestral seats increased by between 25 and 46%. So it's a really interesting example of how the trigger of an association here with gender actually resulted in people hearing music differently. How else does implicit bias play out? Well, implicit bias can play out in how we evaluate someone's work product. So this is a set of images from a test done with law firm partners. The law firm partners were given the biography of potential candidates for the law firm. Some got a biography of a male named Tom Meyer, and they had the picture that you can see in front of you, and they were given a memo that this person had supposedly written. The other half of the group got the same biography and the same memo. Both of the gentlemen were understood to have gone to New York University Law School, an excellent law school. Same memo, same bio. The partners who read the bio of the person who they thought was white, Tom Meyer, who was white, thought he had pretty good skills. He was someone they could work with. And as you'll see on the screen, they noticed on average 2.9 of the 7 intentionally embedded spelling and grammatical errors. The people who read the same bio and the same memo but thought that Tom Meyer was African American, someone said, can't believe he went to NYU. Others said, poor analytic skills. Those could have just been individual comments, but on average, those partners found twice as many of the spelling and grammatical errors. So like the orchestral audition, the people who read the memo thought they could be objective, presumed they could be objective. They're lawyers, but they read the memo through a different lens. And the people who read the memo and thought that the associate was black, when they saw that first typographical error, that triggered a stereotype. And the stereotype then resulted in hypervigilance. So they saw more of the errors that the researchers intentionally put into the memo, frankly, to see whether you'd find the same level of errors when you thought someone was white than black, and obviously they didn't. But again, it was the identical memo. Implicit bias plays itself out in healthcare in really profound ways. And the reason we think healthcare is useful for you to know about is healthcare, like the work many of you do, involves the relationship between, in this instance, a healthcare provider and a patient. Many of you are working with community members, and so you'll have interactions with people. And with healthcare providers, what we see is that bias leads to less friendly treatment by the healthcare provider and the patient. The patient experiences the doctor differently when it's a cross-race or cross-ethnicity interaction. Implicit bias can also lead to the doctors recommending different treatment for the particular medical condition. Again, these doctors don't wake up in the morning not wanting to provide good care, but by virtue of the stereotypes they have, they can identify particular diseases and actually suggest that some patients should have a pill regimen and other patients should have surgery, which is much more intrusive because of stereotypes. Different recommendations for the amount of painkillers that people get. So what this means is even people who, again, get up every morning having done so much work to provide good health care, implicit bias can get in the way. Implicit bias can also play out when it comes to how, again, people hear the same sort of information but through a different lens when it comes to ethnicity. So when we think about Asian Americans, as I mentioned earlier, there's sometimes the assumption that the model minority myth is a net positive for those who are Asian American. But what about Asian Americans who don't want to become engineers, who don't want to become doctors? A colleague of mine, Jerry Kong, did a study where he looked at whether people listening to depositions where lawyers ask someone questions would hear the information differently if they thought the lawyer was Asian American than they thought the lawyer was Caucasian. And it turns out they did. The people who heard the Caucasian lawyer asking information and asking questions thought he was assertive and thought he was warm and that he would be someone who they would recommend to represent their family. People who had displayed implicit bias against Asian Americans on the implicit association test, when they heard the identical voice asking the identical questions, it was the identical tape, heard the lawyer as not sufficiently assertive, as not warm, and they said they would be less likely to recommend him to his family. So again, implicit bias can play out against groups who are seen as having positive stereotypes if those stereotypes don't match the aspirations that the person has for themselves. With respect to some groups, Native Americans, for example, there aren't a lot of negative stereotypes in the current culture, but frankly, Native Americans aren't often seen in our current culture. And so there was a study done to see whether the old stereotypes linking Native Americans to, sort of particular images of sort of the noble savage would have an effect on current day college students. And many of you may know the different disputes over mascots and whether or not mascots can be harmful. The image in front of you is the Fighting Irish, which is Notre Dame's mascot. And in the study, when college students were shown the Fighting Irish mascot, and then 2 weeks later asked whether or not they'd be comfortable having an Irish Catholic American partner in a science lab, it didn't matter whether they'd seen the mascot of the Fighting Irish or not. But those college students who were shown the Fighting Sioux as a mascot, when 2 weeks later they were asked whether they would be willing to have a Native American college student as a partner in a science lab, were less likely to be willing to have a Native American partner. So some stereotypes, even though they're not seen regularly, they haven't been replaced by anything, and so they continue to exist in our unconscious mind. Another way that implicit bias plays itself out. Implicit bias can also affect how we read people's faces. So I know the images in front of you are a little bit creepy. They don't look like real people, but when these images are used and people see them and they just see one or the other, they see the top row of the gentleman who appears to be white or the bottom row of the gentleman who appears to be black, and they're asked, when does this face stop being angry? When is this face neutral? When is this face happy? Most of us who are white are faster to see the white face as neutral or happy, and we take longer to see the black face as not being angry. And the effect on this in the real world is considerable. If we think about when we're interviewing someone for a job, seeing their facial expression is part of how we judge them. We think about how we interact with someone who, again, if you're in the Park Service, you see in the park, how are you reading that person's expression? Are you seeing them as someone friendly, or are you seeing them as someone hostile? It turns out the way we read facial cues can be affected by our implicit biases. We also display our own implicit biases in our body language. So if we have implicit biases toward people of a particular group, and again, oftentimes we don't realize it, we may seem less warm, we may seem more cold or avoidant, we may seem more annoyed or hostile, and that person, of course, reads that, and they don't know where that comes from. They don't know that it's implicit and not explicit, and for them, it feels like they're not being welcomed. It feels like they're not being sort of warmly welcome to and invited to join a particular group or a particular work setting. And so implicit bias can play itself out in a work climate, or it can play itself out in a dynamic between park rangers and visitors, or in all sorts of ways that are really consequential. Race and gender and other different identity characteristics play themselves out in particular ways. So we all know that none of us are a single identity characteristic. None of us are only our race, or only our ethnicity, or only our age, or only our gender. We're all of those things together. But how our gender plays out can be affected, for example, by our race or ethnicity. With respect to a set of stereotypes about gender, that women are more likely to be gentle or to be warm, those stereotypes actually don't apply generally to African American women, who are often seen as being more hostile or angry or aggressive. And again, thinking about the way that stereotypes play out, when a person is seen as more angry or more hostile simply because of the color of their skin, that has profound consequences for how they're treated. For Asian American women, they may be seen as particularly likely to be passive, and so they may be less likely to be given leadership positions. For Latinas, they're often seen as either someone who's, sort of a very virtuous person and therefore understood in a certain way, or someone who is, sort of spicy and angry. So again, a set of negative stereotypes very much linked to caricatures of the culture. The example that you have on your far right is the result of stereotypes about, in this instance, African American women linked to profound tragedy. This is a picture of Glenda Moore. She was a nurse who was living in Staten Island, and during Hurricane Sandy a few years ago, she was trying to drive her children to safety. The water rushed through her car, and her children were literally swept away. She desperately sought help from neighbors, and she knocked on their door, and no one would open the door. And her children died. When people later were asked, why didn't you open the door to help a parent find her child, people said, we didn't see a mother or a parent trying to help her child. We thought there was a black man coming to rob us. So here we see the most profound, the most tragic consequences of stereotypes being applied, literally leading to children's death. And we know similar kinds of stereotypes about criminality, about violence, as applied to African Americans, have led to a host of deaths that we've seen over the past couple of years, a host of tragic deaths. We wouldn't think that implicit bias would play out with respect to children. And I think many of us would hope that today's college students would be far freer from the kind of biases that many of us from earlier generations face. But this was a study done published in 2016, done in 2015, of college students, and the question was, would priming college students with a quick image, an image so fast they didn't even consciously register that they saw it, of either a 5-year-old white boy's face or a 5-year-old black boy's face, affect how quickly the college students could see either toys or crime-related objects such as guns in very grainy, pixelated images. And you would think it would have no effect whatsoever. These are children, innocent, beautiful children. But in fact, being primed with an image of a white 5-year-old boy's face resulted in college students being faster to find toy-related objects, and being primed with a black 5-year-old boy's face resulted in college students finding crime-related objects faster. Again, this does not mean that today's college students are explicitly racist. It doesn't mean that they subscribe consciously to these negative stereotypes. What it does mean is that today's college students, like those of us from other generations, continue to be barraged by these negative stereotypes, and that those negative stereotypes are lodged in their unconscious, and they affect what we see and how fast we see it. So what do we do? How do we respond? How do we address implicit bias? This list on the left is what increases the likelihood of implicit bias. When we're under stress, when we're feeling time pressure, when we're multitasking, when there's a lack of clear criteria for how we make decisions, when we don't have adequate, complete information, and finally, when we don't have a lot of familiarity with a particular group. Unfortunately, most of us in our work lives experience all of these simultaneously, and so implicit bias is often increased in our work lives rather than decreased. And it's important to understand implicit bias isn't reduced just by having good intentions. We recognize that every one of us has good intentions and doesn't want to be implicit bias, but just having those intentions isn't enough. Having someone tell you to reduce your bias isn't enough. If I had told you not to read in the Stroop test that you did earlier, that wouldn't have made it any easier to do that task. Just trying to suppress the bias doesn't work. If I tell you not to think of an elephant, you're probably thinking of an elephant. Avoidance, which often happens when we find out we have implicit bias, it can be very painful to realize, and so it can be a default to try and avoid people from other groups. That certainly doesn't reduce bias, and that just increases the distance between us. And finally, for those of us who really care about issues of race, ethnicity, and fairness, we may think we don't have bias, but there have been hundreds of studies showing that, again, the best of us have biases against some group, all of us, and if we think we don't, we can't take any steps to prevent against them. So what we urge you to do is to recognize just this is how our brains operate, and the work that we need to do as individuals is to identify what are our particular vulnerabilities. And the implicit association test at the Harvard website can be a very good place to go. So what can we do? There are a set of interventions and solutions that can begin the work of reducing the bias. And as an individual, there are steps that you can take to actually reduce your bias and to increase your openness and comfort level with people from other groups. And it requires 5 steps. And the publication that you see in front of you details this at length, and I urge you to take a look at it if you're interested. It's on the Perception Institute website. But very briefly, if you know that if you learn from the implicit association test or from some other way, or you worry that you have implicit bias toward a particular group, you can take these steps. First, watch yourself, examine your behavior, and see what stereotypes you likely have and are reacting to. So as an example, in the study that Patricia Devine, who is the person who identified these set of steps, published, a young woman at the University of Wisconsin recognized that when an African-American man walked by her, she was likely to sort of flinch, hold her purse closer. And that seems like a stereotype, but it's something that happens all the time without people realizing it. She realized that she was doing this. She realized it had everything to do with stereotypes and nothing to do with actual risk. And she realized every time she made that move, likely the gentleman who, or the boy who walked by her may notice that, and he would recognize that what was being communicated to him is that she thought he was dangerous. So that was her first step. The next step is to create counter-stereotypical exemplars in your brain, either and ideally from interactions you have with people you know who are obviously not fitting into the stereotypes that exist in the culture, or if you live in a community where most people look like you, find images around you, watch television shows, read books, see movies, sort of surround yourself with authentic images of people from different groups, and so you don't have this block set of images that are just stereotypes. Work on individuating, seeing people as individuals and not seeing them through the lens of this broad group. That doesn't mean saying to yourself, well, I don't see you as being a member of a particular group if that's how someone self-identifies, because if someone self-identifies as African American, or someone self-identifies as a woman, or someone self-identifies as Asian American, you're not being racist or sexist or sort of biased by recognizing that person's identity category as they see it. Rather, you're seeing them for who they believe themselves to be, and you're respecting that. But then you see them as the individual that they are and don't make a set of assumptions about what being part of that category means. And that means learning things about people, asking questions. Perspective taking is really important. And this doesn't mean thinking, what would I do with my life experiences in the situation that this person is experiencing? An example that's quite powerful comes from the death in Ferguson of Michael Brown. Oftentimes people would say immediately after that death, well, why didn't that gentleman simply step onto the sidewalk when the police officer asked him? I think the image that many of us may have is how it feels if, in my instance, as a middle-aged white woman, a police officer says to me, ma'am, could you step onto the sidewalk? And I say, thank you, officer, I will. He said, be safe, have a wonderful day. That's my experience and my interactions with police officers. That is not the experience that many young men of color have with police officers. And so we have to learn more about the experiences of people from groups other than ours. Finally, and absolutely most importantly, increasing opportunities for peer-to-peer contact. The most powerful predictor of lower levels of implicit bias and of positive relations with people from other groups, not surprisingly, is how many friendships, how many authentic relationships we have with people from other groups. It is the absolute best and really the only long-term way to reduce our biases is to have real relationships with people and to grow to see them as the true individuals they are. In a work situation, we are not going to be able to rid ourselves of all of our implicit biases anytime soon, if ever. Because again, think about all the different groups we can have biases toward. Ethnicity, gender, body type, sexual expression, sexual orientation, religion, all of these are categories into which we put people. So in order to make sure that our workplaces are as fair as they can be, we have to identify metrics, screens, and be aware of the risk of implicit bias affecting our behavior. And so we should make sure that we're setting up ways to not let our first impressions of people determine what kind of performer we think they're going to be. Don't let proxies take the role of seeing who people really are and giving them a fair chance to perform to capacity. We have to be very careful to identify criteria for who should be hired for particular positions before we have the resumes in front of us. And so, again, we're not inadvertently picking the qualities from the resume that fit the gender or the race or ethnicity of the people we think are most qualified. There have been a whole host of studies showing that the name of someone's name on the top of a resume or their gender on the top of a resume can determine how qualified people think that they are. If possible, in work situations, it can be very valuable to have someone evaluate the quality of work who doesn't know who did the work. That way you know it's objective. You can be sure that it's fair. And finally, and most importantly, we all have to be aware of the possibility, the likelihood that we have some biases, because if we presume our own objectivity, that's likely to allow our shortcuts to take over and to prevent us from really taking the time to think slow, to work consciously, to be aware that bias may come into play in how we evaluate people's work, how we interact with people, how we treat them, how we hear and perceive them. And this is all, we can overcome all of these, but we have to do so mindfully and with awareness of the risk in order for it to be successful. So now we'll take a second and pause and move on to a second phenomena that is crucial to understand the way that race and ethnicity play out in the workplace, and that's a concept called racial anxiety.